I will be your session chair. We have 30 minutes, but probably 25 max. We won't have time for questions, Jacobus.
All right.
And with that, I mean, Jacobus has been running the Enterprise Knowledge Graph Foundation, also kind of a partner in agnos.ai. Take it away, Jacobus. We're here listening.
All right. Welcome to this session. My name is Jacobus Geluk, and I'm going to talk about a practical approach to be successful with enterprise knowledge graph technology. For the last 12 years, I've been working with semantic technologies in organizations like JPMorgan Chase, Bloomberg, Bank of New York, and LGT Private Banking. Currently, I'm the founder and CEO of agnos.ai, a consultancy specializing in enterprise knowledge graph technology, and I'm the initiator and one of the founders of the Enterprise Knowledge Graph Foundation. In those 12 years, I've made all the mistakes that you can possibly make, some of them over and over again even. When I look back, though, I see 2 points that I see as the most critical success factors, and these are the key points I'd like to discuss today. Point 1 is that selecting the right use case to start with is critically important. You have to solve an immediate business problem, show real value, and by doing that, create attention and a fan base. And point 2 is that if you cannot make the link to a strategic perspective and make that case very clearly to the highest levels in your organization, then your knowledge graph is never going to become a real EKG. You have to have proper support from the top down, proper leadership at all levels is required. You cannot do this alone, even though you want to. So, okay, let me first try to give my own definition of what an EKG is. It's a term I started using 7 years ago when we were working on a large knowledge graph at Bank of New York with billions of triples. We were doing about 24 wildly different use cases across several lines of business and collecting data from dozens of data sources.
Sorry, Jacobus, interrupt. Are you changing slides? Because we're still on the first one.
Oh, sorry. Yep, this one. My slides are all pictures, by the way, so you don't miss much. Allow me to be a little bit technical on this slide. At Bank of New York and also other companies, we didn't even try to create one dataset out of all those source datasets or one ontology for everything. That's why we started to call that's what we started to call the single version of the truth delusion that we really can't work with and don't need to work with at an enterprise scale. So we started to first create source ontologies describing the meaning of each data source without even thinking about a particular use case yet. So you then end up with an unbiased data set in the form of a graph, usually an RDF file or an RDF stream, that can be used later by any use case. You only have to do this once per data source, which is a huge benefit. You've basically created a completely reusable data set then, which has so many benefits that I can't even explain that in a short presentation. These source ontologies are often specific to one type of system, but sometimes you have many installations of that system. For example, we had 6 different instances of the Jira system. They all obviously share the same source ontologies and same mappings, but you end up with 6 different data sets from 6 different sources. Then for each use case that you're going to support, you have one or more target ontologies. The more, the better. Keep them small and lean and mean. Sometimes you use very large external ontologies, such as FIBO, but usually some small use case specific ontologies will do just fine. You can always worry later to make it enterprise level standard canonical core ontologies or evolve to that point in an agile way, which then led to more like a stovepipe setup in our ETL, like the pillars of the Acropolis, giving you all the wisdom you need. Each pipeline is actually quite simple from a technology perspective. It only has to generate one data set for all the data of one given data source, not multiple, which drastically simplifies things because you do not have to worry about merging all the data from all data sources into one model, which always takes way too much time. We didn't try to deliver one use case, but multiple in parallel. You get to that situation quite quickly if you break down every large use case into its smaller parts, some of which you will be developing in parallel. Eventually, then also working towards multiple higher level use cases. Of course, we had many ontologies that were used in multiple pipelines. Some of them were even overlapping. We could now support multiple versions of the truth, showing how data from one source, for instance, how many computers do we have, could lead to completely different numbers in another source, depending on which data source you look at. Normally, all kinds of teams that work on the ETL of a data warehouse or all kinds of Excel ninjas would then have to figure out which version of the truth would be the right one, which is not just a matter of some difference in some numbers coming from two different sources, because both sources could be right. It's also a difference in interpretation and meaning and context and the use case in that context. The EKG has to support all those contexts. So we need to model the meaning of each source and then mapping between those source and target ontologies. That's basically it. If you mean A here and then can translate it to B there in this way for this use case, and we can translate B to A for that use case, and so forth. So rather than having one giant and biased model with all kinds of compromises and decisions made by people who implement that in obscure ETL scripts or giant SQL statements, often in undocumented ways, we just keep all data sets intact. We position them all next to each other on an equal footing. The EKG can therefore be seen as a collection of self-describing data sets where each data set is a graph on its own that represents the point of view of one given source. And then, based on the use case, which gives you all the context you need, you decide which data sets are relevant, which ontologies are relevant, and so forth. Most of it done is at query time, but you want to optimize for performance and be able to enforce security and enforce all your other policies so that you end up quickly with a service layer in front of many data sources and graph databases, which then also makes it infinitely scalable. So an EKG, from an end user's perspective, it's much like the web. It's a virtual thing with all your data connected, serving any use case you can think of. You don't have to log into 20 different systems to do your work. It's now all in one place. And for each given thing that you work with, you see the fullest possible picture, giving you much richer information, helping you to make better decisions. You don't have to waste time on finding data anymore. It's all there and it's all linked. From a data architecture perspective, it's a large collection of logical data sets where whether they are real-time in-flight data streams or batch-produced data sets, that doesn't matter. Where each data set is a so-called self-describing data set, in the sense that it has all its meaning and policies described as machine-readable structures or executable models, ideally combining open-world and closed-world models such as OWL and SHACL, and with all its identifiers translated to EKG identifiers, which makes it all a giant federated graph that can scale to any size and supports all versions of the truth. From a technology perspective, it's primarily a distributed collection of services that sits between the user and the data sources, where all these services enforce all the various policies that the data owners put in their data sets, such as their entitlement policies, data retention policies, pricing policies, and whatnot. And of course, then also cache the hell out of it and make sure it's not only fast, but also secure and resilient. Last but not least, that service layer also serves all your use cases or your applications. So it's not only giving you data. Don't see the EKG as just another giant data warehouse or analytics platform or so. It's not. It combines data with model-driven functionality. It can run whole apps without requiring any coding. In that sense, it's a low-code or no-code platform, so you will. From a business perspective, it's going to be your most strategic asset that will enable your long-term business vision. That's what I would like to focus on in this presentation.
Just to let you know, you still are on. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. I just wanted to.
Just a few slides. A lot of words. Before getting started, I wanted to talk briefly about an important resource and community for practitioners like yourself, the Enterprise Knowledge Graph Foundation. The EKGF generally does 5 things. The first and foremost thing that the EKGF does is to drive the adoption of EKG by defining what EKG even means and making sure that everyone understands what it is and why you would want it. Then next to that, besides the already existing standards for semantic technologies such as RDF, Sparkle, OWL, SHACL, and linked data, we also need many additional, more or less higher level standards around topics like identifier resolution, entitlement calculation and enforcement, self-describing datasets, and linked to that semantic data catalogs, and executable and reusable use case components. That last point is, to me, the most important one. We need to create an ecosystem like all other technology stacks have, with reusable components, so that people can just download and deploy use case components and compose their EKG of pre-made standard components. No one wants to think too long about use cases like countries and currencies, etc. You just download and deploy those, and then you have everything you ever wanted to know about countries and currencies, including all functionality and user interfaces, all model-driven, of course. The third thing that we do is to work on methods and measurements for best practices, including a maturity model, the so-called EKG Maturity Model, which is primarily designed as a model for managing expectations and explaining what to expect and what to get done to the various audiences that we would like to address. The fourth thing is to create curated lists of all kinds of artifacts, building a curated repository of reusable use cases, the related models and ontologies, best practices, training programs, data sets, tools, lists of vendor products, and lists of consultants who we eventually like to certify as well. Then last but not least, something that's already going quite well, we're building a community of users around EKG, working on all these things, but also sharing knowledge and experience using Slack and all kinds of Zoom calls. For instance, there's a special Zoom call, I have to say, it's currently invite only, for every team head that is already running an EKG in production, sharing experiences about the hardest challenges to deal with. I encourage you to explore the website and to join the foundation either as a private person, it's free, or as a corporate member, helping us shape the EKG industry. Allow me to come up with a common sense statement that I think everyone can agree with. Technology needs to solve a business problem. The problem is that we have so many business problems to solve and we have so many technologies to solve those problems with. You could argue that for every given problem, every large enterprise has at least a dozen different technology stacks available to solve it. And if you have a very project-oriented company culture, then for every given problem, you may end up with yet another bespoke solution and possibly yet another silo. That's why some large enterprises literally have tens of thousands of systems and have every possible technology stack in production. If you then think about the total cost of ownership to keep each of those systems with all those different technologies alive during their whole life cycle, then you can imagine that the luxury of having such a siloed landscape is extremely expensive. Any large bank, for instance, easily spends billions of dollars every year on keeping this all up in the air. And it's not just expensive, it also holds everyone back. It slows everything down. Startups do not have that problem. So how can we get large organizations to become as lean as the startups, if that will ever happen? EKG seems to be one of the only sensible ways to get out of this structural mess. If that's not one of your major end goals, then EKG may not be for you. If you're just into solving one problem with yet another silo using semantic technology, then that's great. Just don't call it an EKG then. You're then just building a knowledge graph, which is fine, but it will be much harder to then evolve from that to EKG. That's perhaps a bit provocative, but I think it needs to be clear that when you start with EKG, you need to do a few things to get into the right lane. That leads to some longer-term objectives, such as reducing the number of silos and getting your knowledge graph to EKG level at some point. And yes, we are leveraging all the cool stuff that semantic technology provides, such as ontologies and reasoning and distributed federated graphs, etc. But that's just only one relatively small part of the EKG message. That's the stuff that we are using in the engine room of the ship. But when you talk to the business, you need to discuss where the whole ship is going. We need to know what the desired destination is and explain that EKG can actually get us there. That requires you to speak the language of the executives and the boardrooms and the management consultants. You somehow have to make the link to that language. And unfortunately, we now also need to talk a little bit about the how, explain why this is different. Yes, ontology and all that are very important, but when we really what we really should talk about with the business is how you can compose your business services from reusable EKG components and how to get to a level of maturity where you can deliver critical business value. Get the business to understand the power of this and have them own it and let them imagine how to leverage it and how it will change their game. Without that understanding and leadership and buy-in from senior management, your first steps on the EKG journey are likely to fail. Think big first, then start small and deliver real value fast, then scale up. Technologists can think big all they want, but if they don't communicate all those brilliant ideas with their own business execs, then what's the point? You need to get them to think big as well, to think with you. EKG is not something you can do on your own. You need to get all the other stakeholders to not only understand the strategic value of this, but to wholeheartedly support it and do everything they can do to make it successful. They need to show true leadership with skin in the game. So create a shared vision in non-technical terms, organize a bit of light training in the form of workshops into this new way of thinking for all stakeholders so that they understand the basic idea. Explain why EKG is different, but again, try to stay away from the pure technical topics. You otherwise quickly let everyone miss the point. It's not about all kinds of technical details. Get your audience to understand that they can really allow themselves to think outside the box when it comes to what they want. Otherwise, you end up talking about minor gradual improvements on their current landscape of applications, processes, services, all in a siloed world. We want to create some room for what if there are no such limits anymore. Basically, try to create a safe space that allows everyone to openly dream ahead, to brainstorm about the future. Take your audience out of their current comfort zone and get their long-term ambitions formulated. So you want to know where they want to be in a few years' time. That sounds simple, but it doesn't really happen that much. It's not very trendy. With Agile, everyone works their way forward step by step, and that's all fine, but sometimes it helps to think ahead more strategically, especially if you want to achieve some long-term goals and work your way towards those goals. You better make sure that then everyone understands what those goals are. So try to get that discussion going with the business and have a structured approach to it. Capture those strategic outcomes as strategic use cases, like, for instance, real-time fraud detection or so, and then work with them to break those strategic use cases down into their smaller parts. This will look like some sort of upside down tree structure. You can do this initially on a whiteboard with the strategic use case at the top. At the bottom of such a tree structure, you'll get small sub-use cases like the management of countries and jurisdictions or billing or so. Each of these use cases starts as a circle on a whiteboard. It's just a placeholder for a bunch of business requirements. It's about finding the right focus and scope to start with. The what and the why, not the how. Which groups of requirements are there? How do we call them from now on? Why do we want it? How does it contribute to higher level goals? Without talking at all about screen layouts, record layouts, report layouts, models, ontologies, current applications, or current databases. We leave that all out. It's not important at this stage. We just focus on getting all the mandatory and desired requirements, all ambitions and high-level goals on paper or on the whiteboard, and eventually turn all of that into a model in the EKG itself. That use case tree model is critically important and the most important artifact that everyone should talk about. By the way, I've put this simplistic picture that I stole from someone's website on this slide. You get the point. Your use case tree will not look this simple. And don't repeat the term manage in every use case, by the way. Just say contracts or budgets, etc. Each use case in these trees becomes a component with its own life cycle. Build it as a generic component, as a product almost. Some of them can be downloaded from the EKGF or from colleagues in other lines of business. Build these things as generic reusable components that can be used to serve many higher level use cases, allowing the business to continuously reconfigure and reorganize itself. That alone is quite different from what everyone is doing today, because making things generic and reusable beyond your current scope, that's something you need to think about. Normally, you don't get the chance to do this properly. It will never be perfect in one go, but you have to make everyone aware that the reusability of everything you create is important. When we select our first use case, we need to solve a real business issue that results in saving money or growing our revenue or making our customers happier and so forth. But before we get to that point of selecting that first use case, we first need to make sure that we position it right, manage expectations properly, and define with the business what success means. And then not just deliver yet another silo, but show how that first use case is the first deliverable on the longer term journey that leads to achieving some strategic business objectives that cannot be done today. What could help, this is just a suggestion, is to discuss two megatrends in business that intersect with EKG. First, there's the idea of composable business. Gartner is putting that out there quite prominently. The idea of a composable business is about creating your business from interchangeable and reusable building blocks, like Lego bricks. This goes far beyond organizing your APIs for each business area. The concept of composable business matches perfectly with the structure of any mature EKG, in the sense that the organization of all the use case components of an EKG gives you the ability to compose your business from it, or at least the IT parts of it. Another trend is the idea of seeing data as the fuel for your business, becoming a data-centric organization. Data fuels business growth, and data volume is growing exponentially, like we all know, with 90% of the data generated in the last 2 years. Data is sprawling across more devices, applications, and cloud platforms, and it is in more formats than ever before, and ends up being stored in silos as commodities. That is inefficient and expensive. Data silos result in up to 30% of revenue loss for your organization. Technologies like data lakes, data warehouses, unified analytics, AI, and machine learning, and all kinds of other magical stuff have so far not resolved the situation. In fact, the number of silos still goes up, not down. So you could say that so far there's nothing out there that really gets those numbers down. One big element that's missing is the meaning of data. In fact, you could say that there's some quite fundamental thing going wrong. With all those petabytes of data out there, we need to do something more than just trying to number crunch it with machine learning. And I think that's capturing the meaning of all that data as well, not just the data itself. What we need is meaning as data in a machine-readable form, so that programs can understand more of the data, reducing the amount of human involvement, which then allows us to keep up with the exponential growth of data and number of data sets, or increase overall quality. Combining all these challenges with the way today's businesses are run, their emphasis on short-term results, risk aversion, and the need of qualitative outcomes that directly show the money. It's a balancing act between short and long-term objectives. Use the use case tree method to discover the right use case to start with, and where you can solve a real business problem in a relatively short time, where success can be quantified in terms of money. Properly manage expectations. We're not going to kill any silos anytime soon, and we're not going to deliver those strategic use cases anytime soon either. But when you deliver your first Lighthouse use case for the EKG, it will be clear to everyone that we are all on the journey towards some longer-term objectives that everyone knows about. This, of course, needs strong project management and leadership at many levels, technical leadership, organizational leadership, and most importantly, political leadership. It's 90% communication, I would say. Sorry. So when I say think big, start small, and scale fast, I mean that that is an effective model to select your first successful EKG use case. It also is a guideline for follow-on use cases. Here's what I mean with it. First, think big. Project an end state for your use of the EKG that goes beyond a single use case, and envision a situation 3 to 5 years out. Then also work out your tree of use cases with different levels of detail, of course. Just work out that part of your use case tree where you see the roadmap that leads to your stated end goals, together with the business, and make sure they own it. Then start small. You've now discovered and identified the first use case that is part of your vision, is very relevant to the business, and has quantifiable success. It also needs to be deliverable quickly. Think about delivering an MVP within 8 weeks. Then after having delivered your first use case in production, end-to-end, scale fast, and use the success of your first use case to rapidly onboard more use cases and more data sets, etc. Aim for exponential growth of use cases, and demonstrate that with every delivery of yet another use case, you can leverage the reusability of all previous use case components. Okay, so besides that, there are some other practical things you can do. Have a structured approach. And like I already said, it's the use case tree and all that, that's the leading principle. Keep working on envisioning the future in a structured way. Keep that up. Don't leave that behind, but keep it up to date continuously. Have a quantifiable business case for each of your use cases with hard data. You need that to track progress and success. No one cares about qualitative data points or soft data such as people productivity or so. Over-invest in project management. Communicate early and often and be very specific. Also use this to train people. For example, send out formal and informal communication. Use non-jargon. Focus on showing, not telling. All right. Give me a second. So what's a good first use case? Ideally, you find one that you can position as a lighthouse use case. Do not position it as a POC because that's too risky. There's a very big chance that you're going to fail with it or nothing happens after you've delivered it. Most POCs fails. POCs allow senior management to not commit to anything and have no skin in the game. Don't let them get away with that. And also, we are not here to prove that the technology works. It works. We are not solving a technical problem. We are going to solve a business problem. A pilot is also not good enough. That still gives no real commitment. We need to sell this better. Call it a lighthouse project. If it succeeds, it will be the light beacon for all subsequent use cases. It's positioned as a major strategic milestone. From then on after, things are going to change and are going to be done differently. Make sure that you end up delivering multiple sub-use cases, each of which has the highest potential for reusability. Think about your next use case and how all your lighthouse subcomponents will be reused to deliver even faster on your second use case. That's actually one of the most important benefits of the EKG. It's a structure for the reusability of not only your data, but also everything that you do with it. So it's key that you can demonstrate the power of reuse. Okay, this is my last slide. Let's go. Quick recap. This is the only slide with some text on it. You can read this for yourself. The only thing I would like to emphasize is work with the people at the EKGF. Get us involved in reviewing your use case tree, for example. I believe that there's a meeting room after this where we can maybe continue our conversation. Any questions?
All right. Thank you very much, Jacobus. We got 1-2 minutes for questions. No questions. Is there? I don't have a way to go see questions on the chat.
I'm looking for questions.
Yeah, if you can see questions on the chat, if there's anything.
Have you seen EKG in hospital environment? Well, I know that the medical industry, AstraZeneca, for example, is doing EKG. It's used in life sciences a lot.
No other questions around here? All right, Dean.
You gave a bit of a hint of advice about use case descriptions by saying, don't just throw the word manage around there. And this has been a bugbear of mine for a while too, that people will say, oh yeah, we want to talk about, well, we're going to manage payroll. Well, what exactly does that mean? Do you have, can you delve into that a little bit more? If you wanted to say manage and you struck out the word manage, like you said, is there something you could put in instead that would actually give you a bit more benefit downstream? And that's the problem with manage. You say manage, and then downstream you say, well, what did you mean by manage? And nobody knows.
Yeah.
Can you give some advice about what you should replace that word manage with when you strike it out?
No, the question is, do you want to put a verb in it anyway, right? It's because the term use case should be taken a little bit more lightly than the strict OMG definition of what a use case is. It's a little bit more broader concept. Basically it evolves. You maybe start with one small use case, manage the creation of countries in my country's database, for example. So that might be your first name for it, and then you can change the name of use cases. But the point is, you have to always ask the business, because it's like when I order a house and I want 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, and a kitchen, then for the whole life cycle of that house, everyone involved will always understand what I mean. The electrician, the plumber, etc. We always know what the bedroom is supposed to do and what the bathroom is supposed to do, etc. So I basically would like to have the same idea for EKG. The EKG is not one massive collection of triples of trillions of facts, but it's structured in components, and I would say call these components use cases. But those components will eventually do more and more. So anything you ever wanted to do with countries and jurisdictions, that's done by this evolved use case with that same name. So that's basically what it's good to see you from behind, by the way.
All right, with that, Jacobus, thank you very much. Let's give him a round of applause. All right, our next speaker is